What would you do if, at 19 years old, you had nothing left but a coat, a carpet bag, and $6 sewn into your hem? That was the whole of Adelaide Sorensen's world on the morning the bankmen nailed a notice to her father's door and told her the house, the horses, and the Icehouse cooperative he had built with his own two hands now belonged to Millhaven Trust. The man who signed the order was Elias Crane, a banker with soft hands and a colder heart who had once eaten supper at her family's table. With her $6, Addie did not buy bread, or a train ticket east, or a room to sleep in. She walked instead to the auction block by the frozen lake and bid on the one thing nobody else wanted, the old flooded ice house at the edge of town, sold for scrap at $6 even, its walls half collapsed and packed with rotten straw. The townsfolk laughed. They called her a fool chasing her dead father's shadow into a ruin that wasn't fit to store turnips. But behind the ice wall of that condemned building was something sealed away that no one, not even Elias Crane, knew was there. Something that would not only save Adelaide Sorensen, but restore an entire town to life. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Sorensen. If you're watching this from a town that people wrote off too soon, tell us where you're from in the comments. And if stories like Adelaide's stir something in you, follow or subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. Millhaven, Wisconsin, sat on the shoulder of a long, cold lake, whose name the Ojibwe had given it long before the loggers and the ice cutters came, and which the settlers had shortened, out of laziness or affection, simply to the Vermilion. In the winter of 1897, the town's whole living came from that lake, from the great sheets of ice that men cut from its surface, with long saws and horse-drawn plows, floated to shore on channels of black water, and packed away in sawdust to be sold come summer to ice houses as far south as Chicago and St. Louis. It was hard work, dangerous work, and it belonged, more than to any single man, to the cooperative that Adelaide's grandfather, old Magnus Halvorsen, had founded 30 years before. A modest company owned in shares by every family who worked the harvest, so that no single winter's misfortune could ruin any one household entirely. It was Magnus who taught Adelaide's father, Thomas Sorensen, the trade, and it was Thomas who taught Adelaide, though she was a girl, and the ice trade had no formal place for girls. She learned anyway, trailing her father onto the lake before dawn in her wool stockings and her brother's old boots, learning to read the color of ice like a physician reads a fevered brow, the milky places that meant weakness, the clear blue-black places that meant it would bear a wagon's weight, the drumming sound beneath her feet that told her when the lake was speaking a warning. Her mother had died birthing her, so it was her father who raised her, and what he gave her, more than any single skill, was a way of seeing the world, that nothing was worthless until you had truly looked at it, that a cracked block of ice might still cool a fever, that a broken thing was very often only a thing waiting for someone patient enough to understand its shape. He used to say the whole cooperative was built on that idea, that Magnus Halvorsen had pooled the shares of poor families precisely because he believed no man's hard luck should be allowed to swallow him whole, so long as his neighbors could catch him first. Adelaide grew up believing this the way other children believed in Scripture, and she grew up too, watching her father grow gray and slow under the weight of running a business built on trust in a country that was rapidly deciding trust was bad for interest rates. By the time she was 17, the Panic of '93 had rolled through the whole of the country like a second winter. Banks failing east and west, credit drying up like a creek in August, and small cooperative enterprises like the Millhaven Ice Company found themselves suddenly, viciously vulnerable to any lender who smelled blood in the water. That was when Elias Crane arrived in Millhaven, not as an enemy at first, but as a friend, soft-spoken, well-dressed, full of talk about modernizing the harvest, about loans that would let the co-op buy steam-driven saws and iron rail cars instead of relying on horses and hand tools. Thomas trusted him, in part because Magnus Halvorson, before he died, had trusted men like that too little, and men like his own neighbors too well, and Thomas had spent his whole life trying to be more generous than his father had been suspicious. Adelaide remembered sitting on the stairs, listening to her father and Crane talk business by lamplight. Remembered how her father's laugh had sounded easy and unafraid, and how she had felt, even then, a small, cold seed of unease she could not yet name. The way you feel a change of weather in your knees before the sky has shown a single cloud. The debt came due in the coldest February anyone in Millhaven could remember, and it came due all at once, in a manner nobody but Elias Crane had expected. He called the loan early, citing a clause Thomas Sorensen had signed without a lawyer present. A clause that no one in town, least of all a trusting ice cutter with an 8th grade education, had understood to mean what Crane now insisted it meant. Thomas fought it as best he could, traveling to Ashland to consult what lawyer he could afford. Mortgaging first the harvest equipment, then the horses, then finally the cooperative's charter itself in a desperate bid to buy time. But the winter that should have brought the town's whole yearly income instead brought an early thaw. A soft, sickly, unseasonable warmth that rotted the harvest on the lake before half of it could be cut. And there was no income left to save. Thomas Sorensen died that spring, not of any single dramatic cause, the doctor said, but of a heart that had simply, quietly, given out under the accumulated weight of shame and failure. The kind of death that leaves no mark on a death certificate, but is understood perfectly by everyone who watches a proud man lose everything he built. Adelaide buried her father in the small cemetery above the lake, in a grave beside her mother's, and she had not yet finished grieving when Elias Crane's men came with the foreclosure notice, seizing the family home, the last 2 horses, and every remaining asset of the Millhaven Ice Cooperative, including the crumbling old original Icehouse down by the channel. The very first one Magnus Halvorson had ever built, long since replaced by newer, larger houses and left to flood and rot, useless, forgotten, worth nothing to anyone. The townsfolk who had once shared in her grandfather's cooperative now found their shares worthless paper, and many blamed Thomas Sorensen's trust in Crane for their ruin, so that Adelaide inherited not only poverty, but a kind of quiet suspicion from neighbors who had once loved her family. She was left, at 19, utterly alone, with $6 silver her father had hidden in a tin behind a loose brick, a single carpetbag of clothes, and nowhere in the world that was rightfully hers to stand. The auction of the cooperative's remaining assets was held on the courthouse steps on a raw April morning, the mud still frozen in ruts from the winter's wagons, and Adelaide stood at the back of the small crowd wrapped in her father's old coat, watching strangers and neighbors alike bid away pieces of her family's life. The good equipment went quickly and for real money, bought mostly by Crane's own agents, who intended, it was whispered, to consolidate the whole ice trade under the bank's ownership. But when the auctioneer came at last to the old flooded Icehouse, half its roof caved in from a storm 2 winters past, its lower walls perpetually damp from a spring that fed up through the earth beneath it, useless for storing anything that needed to stay dry. The crowd only laughed, and no one bid at all. The auctioneer, embarrassed, dropped the price to $6 simply to close the sale and be done with the sorry building. And it was in that silence, that particular silence of a town writing off something as worthless, that Adelaide heard her own voice call out the sum before she had entirely decided to speak. Heads turned. She saw the disbelief on their faces, saw pity mixed with something sharper, mockery thinly dressed as concern, heard someone mutter that the girl was chasing ghosts, that grief had turned her foolish, that she'd have been wiser to spend her $6 on a train ticket to relatives in Duluth than on a ruin not fit to shelter goats. She did not answer them. She only walked up, paid her $6 into the auctioneer's ledger, and took the key to a building that, by every practical measure, was worth nothing at all, except that it had been the very first ice house her grandfather Magnus ever built. The one he was proudest of, the one her father always spoke of with a strange, careful reverence that Adelaide, until that moment, had never fully understood. She moved into a corner of it that very night, the driest corner she could find, spreading a blanket over a raised plank floor and telling herself she would sort out some better plan by morning. Though in truth she had no plan at all beyond stubbornness and a bone-deep unwillingness to let Elias Crane see her leave town in defeat. It was in trying to make that corner livable, clearing away decades of rotted straw and broken barrel staves, that she noticed something odd about the ice house's inner wall, the one built directly into the earthen bank the building was set against. Where every other wall showed the ordinary rough logwork of a working building, this one section, low near the floor and cleverly hidden behind a false facing of loose fieldstone, was built with a precision that didn't match the rest of the structure at all. Squared timbers, fitted tight and true, plastered over in a way that had clearly been meant to look, to any casual eye, like nothing more than the natural stone foundation of the hill itself. Curious, and with nothing better to do in the dark but wonder, she pried loose one stone, then another, working by lamplight with a rusted pry bar she'd found among the debris, and behind the third stone her fingers found not earth, but wood, a door, no taller than her own chest, its hinges gone stiff with age but not entirely seized, set into the hillside behind what had, for 30 years, appeared to be nothing more than a wall. Her heart beat so hard she could hear it over the drip of meltwater outside, and for a long moment she simply knelt there in the cold, her hand flat against that hidden door, feeling, with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone, that her grandfather Magnus had built this place not merely to store ice, but to keep something safe. It took her 3 more nights of careful, quiet work, done always after dark, so that no one passing on the road might see lamplight where none should be, to clear enough of the old stone and rusted iron latch to finally pull that small door open. And when she did, the space beyond took her breath entirely away. It was a chamber no larger than a modest pantry, dug back into the dry clay of the hillside itself, lined with cedar boards to keep the damp at bay, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, she found what her grandfather Magnus Halvorson had hidden there some time before his death. A strong box of gold and silver coin, modest by the standards of any Eastern bank but a genuine fortune to a town like Millhaven, and beside it, more precious still, a leather-bound ledger written in her grandfather's own careful, slanting hand. The ledger was not a record of secret wealth for its own sake. It was the true original charter of the Millhaven Ice Cooperative, listing every family's shares exactly as Magnus had first apportioned them, along with a private account of a decision he had made near the end of his life. One Adelaide's father had apparently never known that Magnus, distrustful of a certain young banker's father, who had once tried to buy controlling interest in the co-op by manipulating its books, had quietly withdrawn a portion of the cooperative's reserve fund in hard coin and hidden it here. In the one building he was certain no banker would ever think worth acquiring, meaning it to be a store against exactly the kind of ruin that had, a generation later, actually come to pass. Reading her grandfather's words by lamplight, Adelaide understood for the first time that she was not merely the accidental owner of a flooded ruin, She was the last living keeper of Magnus Halvorsson's true intentions for the town he had built his life around, and that the fortune in that hidden room did not belong to her alone. It belonged, by her grandfather's own hand, to every family whose name was written in that ledger, the very families now suffering under the weight of Elias Crane's foreclosures. The deeper Adelaide read that ledger over the following days, sitting wrapped in blankets by lamplight, while rain dripped steadily somewhere above her through the ruined roof. The more she understood that her grandfather's hidden fund was only half the mystery waiting inside that hillside chamber. Tucked beneath the strongbox, wrapped separately in oiled canvas, she found a second set of papers. Older and more damning, correspondence between Magnus Halvorsson and a lawyer in Ashland, dated some 15 years earlier, documenting his discovery that a young clerk at the regional bank, a clerk named Elias Crane, then new to the profession and eager to make his name, had been quietly altering interest calculations on loans made to small cooperatives across the county, skimming a fraction here and a fraction there in a scheme too small for any single victim to notice, but large enough, compounded across dozens of loans over dozens of years, to have made Crane a wealthy man entirely off the backs of farmers and tradesmen who trusted him. Magnus had never been able to prove it conclusively enough to bring formal charges. Crane was clever and careful, and the law in those days was slow to suspect a banker over a laborer's word. But he had kept every scrap of evidence he could gather, believing that someday someone would need it. Adelaide realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the Icehouse's damp cold, that the very loan clause Crane had used to seize her father's business, the clause Thomas had signed without understanding, bore Crane's unmistakable fingerprints, the same manner of quiet technical deception her grandfather had documented a generation before. It was not merely misfortune that had destroyed her family. It was the same man, grown older and far more powerful, finishing a theft he had begun in his youth. She sat with that knowledge for a long while, feeling grief and fury braid themselves together into something colder and steadier than either alone, and she understood that the true fortune sealed behind that ice wall was not the coin at all, but the ledger, proof, at last, of exactly what Elias Crane was. Proof that could either be buried again to keep her safely fed and clothed for the rest of her life, or spent, at considerable personal risk, to save an entire town that had, in its grief, largely turned against her. She did not sleep well deciding what to do with what she'd found, torn between a young woman's very reasonable wish for safety and a granddaughter's inherited sense of what was owed. In the end, it was a small thing that decided her. An old woman named Mrs. Petrov, who had lost her husband to a lake accident years before and now lived on what little her cooperative shares had once been worth, stopped Adelaide on the road one morning not to mock her, as others had, but simply to ask, with weary kindness, whether the girl had anywhere warm to sleep, and pressed a wrapped biscuit into her hand, though she herself had precious little to spare. It was such a small act of decency from a woman who had every reason to resent the Sorensen name, and it settled something in Adelaide that all her grandfather's coin could not have settled alone. She decided that whatever came of it, she would not hoard what Magnus Halvorsson had hidden for people like Mrs. Petrov. She would use it, and she would use the ledger too, though she understood clearly that doing so meant declaring open war on the most powerful man in Millhaven. Word travels fast in a small town, and faster still when it concerns a young woman living alone in a condemned building. So it was perhaps inevitable that within a fortnight, Elias Crane himself came calling. His fine black buggy incongruous on the muddy track down by the old Icehouse, his manner as smooth and unbothered as ever, though Adelaide noticed his eyes moved quickly, appraisingly, over the building's exterior in a way that told her he had heard some rumor, however garbled, of unusual activity there. He offered, with an expression of great sympathy, to buy the Icehouse back from her for $50, an absurd sum for a ruin she had paid $6 for, and precisely the kind of offer she understood at once. That only made sense if a man knew or suspected something valuable was hidden inside it. She declined, politely, watching something harden behind his practiced warmth. And from that day forward the pressure against her mounted steadily, and by increasingly ugly means. Crane's men spread word that the girl was unstable, living alone like a hermit among rats and rot, unfit company for decent families. The general store, whose owner held a note with Crane's bank, quietly stopped extending her the small credit she'd been surviving on. And one night, someone, never proven, though everyone in town understood well enough who had likely ordered it, set fire to the woodpile she'd stacked against the Icehouse's outer wall, a fire that, had the wind shifted, might easily have taken the whole structure and everything sealed inside it. Adelaide fought the flames alone in her nightclothes with a bucket from the channel, and it was, strangely, that fire, visible from half the town in the dark, that finally began turning opinion back in her favor. For even those who thought her foolish could not quite believe a girl deserved to be burned out of a building she had honestly purchased. She understood she could not simply wait for sympathy to accumulate. Crane was not a patient man, and having failed to buy or burn her out, he would soon try something more direct, likely some legal maneuver to void her purchase entirely on a technicality, the same weapon he had used against her father. So she made her decision, and began, carefully and in secret, preparing to bring her grandfather's evidence into the light before Crane could strike first. She chose the town's spring assembly for her moment, a gathering held every year in the Millhaven Meeting House to discuss the coming ice season, an event Crane himself always attended, both to project an image of civic partnership and to quietly direct the town's business affairs from behind a mask of neighborly concern. Adelaide arrived with her grandfather's ledger wrapped carefully in cloth beneath her coat, and when the assembly opened its floor to any resident wishing to speak, she stood, and her voice, though it trembled at first, grew steadier with every sentence. She told them of the hidden chamber, of Magnus Halvorson's original fund set aside for exactly this kind of ruin. And then, watching Elias Crane's composed face begin, for the first time she had ever seen, to lose its color, she read aloud from her grandfather's 15-year-old correspondence, laying out in Crane's own recorded pattern of deception the precise method by which he had altered loan terms family after family, cooperative after cooperative, all across the county. She had brought, too, copies made secretly at the county recorder's office of several other Crane loan contracts, showing the very same disputed clause that had ruined her father buried in nearly identical language in at least 4 other agreements, proof this was no isolated misunderstanding, but a practiced method. The meeting house, silent at first in shock, began to fill with a low, furious murmur as neighbor turned to neighbor, each recognizing in Adelaide's account some version of their own hardship, their own trust, betrayed by the same soft, reasonable voice that had sat across so many kitchen tables, promising modernization and progress. Crane tried to speak, tried to dismiss the girl as grief-addled and dishonest, but the county recorder's own documents, impossible to forge, spoke for themselves, and within days a formal inquiry was opened by the Regional Banking Commission, an inquiry that would, over the following months, cost Elias Crane his charter, his standing, and very nearly his freedom, though in the end he escaped prison only by fleeing west with what remained of his fortune, a ruined and friendless man trading one kind of exile for another, which the town of Millhaven came, with time, to regard as its own quiet, sufficient justice. With Crane's fraud exposed and his hold over the bank broken, the path was cleared for Adelaide to do what she had, in truth, decided to do the very night Mrs. Petroff pressed that biscuit into her hand. She did not keep her grandfather's fortune for herself, though the law would certainly have allowed her to. The coin having been found on property she had legally purchased. Instead, working with what honest bankers remained in the region and with the county's newly interested regulators, she used the fund to reconstitute the Millhaven Ice Cooperative exactly as Magnus Halvorson had first designed it, buying back the seized equipment at fair prices from the receivership that followed Crane's downfall, and restoring the original shares to every family listed in her grandfather's ledger, including families who had spoken unkindly of her only weeks before. She kept for herself only enough to rebuild the old Icehouse properly, this time with a sound roof and a dry floor, though she left the hidden chamber exactly as it was, a private memorial to Magnus's foresight, rather than a vault for further secrets. By the following winter, the harvest on the Vermilion ran again under cooperative ownership, ice cut and packed by the same familiar hands, sold once more for the shared benefit of the whole town rather than the private profit of a distant bank. And Adelaide Sorensen, once mocked on the courthouse steps as a fool chasing ghosts, found herself instead elected, at not yet 20 years of age, to sit on the cooperative's board of trustees in her grandfather's old chair. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a 19-year-old girl standing alone at an auction with $6 silver and a coat that had belonged to her dead father, buying a ruin that everyone else in Millhaven had already decided was worthless. It would have been easy, in that moment, to see only what the crowd saw: a flooded, collapsing building, a foolish girl making a foolish choice out of grief rather than sense. But Adelaide Sorensen understood something her neighbors, and even her own father, had briefly forgotten: that value does not always announce itself plainly. That the things a community writes off too quickly are very often the things holding its truest inheritance. Whether that inheritance is coin, or memory, or simply the stubborn insistence that people who trust one another deserve to be protected from those who would exploit that trust. She did not become wealthy in the way the world usually measures wealth. She gave most of what she found back to the very people who had once doubted her. What she became instead was something rarer, and in Millhaven at least, longer remembered: the woman who looked at a wall everyone else called worthless, and found behind it the whole buried faith of a town, waiting quietly to be restored. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Adelaide Sorensen's story. If her patience and her refusal to give up on a place others had abandoned meant something to you, we'd love for you to share this video with someone who needs a little reminder that overlooked things are not always worthless things. We'll leave you tonight with a question worth sitting with. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we always love hearing where our stories find you. And if you'd like to walk with us into more forgotten corners of the American frontier, we'd be glad to have you follow or subscribe so you never miss the next story we have to tell. Until next time, stay close.